I'm sitting on a borrowed plastic chair, looking at a billion-dollar view I used to own. Every cliff, every stretch of sand, mine. $300 million, all built on this coast. All gone in 12 hours. The sound of the waves. It's not soothing anymore. It's the ghost of a warning I was too arrogant to hear. There are two kinds of people who look at the ocean. Those who see its beauty, and those who see its power. For 30 years I was the fool who thought I only had to reckon with the beauty. I believed its power was something I could build against, something I could tame with concrete foundations and shatterproof glass. It turns out the ocean has a very long memory, and it doesn't take kindly to being underestimated. My name is Arthur Jensen. I'm 65 years old, and this is the story of how I built an empire on sand, and how the ocean came to collect its rent. It didn't start with money. It never does it? It started with the smell of sawdust and salt. My father was a carpenter, a true craftsman from a generation that believed your name was only as good as your last job. His hands were maps of hard work, calloused and scarred, but they could create magic from a simple plank of wood. He taught me everything. Measure twice, cut once, Arthur, he'd say, his voice thick with the gravity of a commandment. It was a lesson about wood, of course, but it was also a lesson about life, a lesson I would one day forget at the most critical moment. We weren't coastal elites. Far from it. We were the people who serviced their world. Our family vacations were spent in a cramped second-hand travel trailer, parked in the cheapest lot we could find, a mile or two from the pristine beaches where the wealthy had their summer homes. Every morning, I'd wake up early and walk down to the shore. I'd watch the sun rise over these magnificent houses, these glass and timber palaces that seemed to grow out of the cliffs themselves. I wasn't jealous of the people inside. I was in awe of the structures. I would study the lines, the way a roof angled just so to capture the morning light, the way a deck cantilevered over the rocks, making you feel like you were floating above the water. To my young eyes, those houses weren't just shelter. They were monuments to a dream. And I wanted to be the man who built them. After high school, I followed my father into the trades. I swung a hammer, I poured concrete, I framed houses under the blistering sun. I worked for other people, bigger construction firms that built the very homes I used to admire. And I saw the business from the inside. I saw the cheap materials they'd hide behind expensive finishes. I saw the corners they'd cut to pad their profits. I saw the disconnect between the builders and the land they were building on. They treated the coastline like a blank canvas, something to be conquered. I still had that boy's reverence for it. I believed you had to work with the landscape, not against it. That was my edge. I just needed a chance to prove it. My chance came in the form of a piece of land everyone else had written off. It was a jagged, rocky outcrop, deemed unbuildable by every other contractor in town. It was a logistical nightmare, but it had a view that could make a man weep. For 2 years I poured every dollar I had and every dollar I could borrow into that small parcel. I sold my car, I lived on ramen noodles and coffee, I called in every favor I was ever owed. And I built. I didn't just build, I sculpted. I designed a small, modest bungalow that seemed to rise organically from the rocks, with a single, massive pane of glass facing the ocean. It was my heart and soul rendered in wood and stone. The day I put it on the market, the local real estate agents laughed at my asking price. It was triple what I had spent. "You're crazy, Jensen," one of them told me. "No one's paying that for a one-bedroom shack on a pile of rocks." He was wrong. It sold in a week to a tech executive from the city who said it was the most peaceful place he'd ever seen. I'll never forget the feeling of holding that first check. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. It was the sound of a door swinging open to a future I had only dared to imagine. That first victory, it was sweeter than any multi-million-dollar deal that came later. It was the pure, uncut validation that I could turn sweat and vision into gold. And speaking of reaching out and making a connection, if you're finding some part of your own journey in my story, do me a favor and click that subscribe button. I'm sharing this for a reason, and I want to make sure it reaches who it needs to. And let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's humbling to think how far a story can travel. That first house was the spark. What followed was an inferno of ambition. One house became two. 2 became a small, exclusive development. I reinvested every penny. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by an insatiable hunger to build, to create, to expand. I created a brand, Jensen Coastal Living. It became synonymous with quality, with artistry, with a seamless blend of luxury and nature. My obsession was with the details others overlooked, the specific grain of the imported hardwood, the precise temperature of the lighting, the way the sound of the ocean could be heard from every room. I wasn't just building vacation homes, I was building sanctuaries, and the wealthy paid a premium for it. The first $1 million came and went without much fanfare. My eyes were already on the $10 million mark. I was relentless. I sacrificed everything at the altar of my work, friendships, relationships, sleep. I had a singular focus, to become the undisputed king of this coastline, to own the view from every prime location, to put my signature on the horizon itself. And then, I found it. The crown jewel. A sprawling piece of land at the very tip of the peninsula, perched atop the highest cliff, with a breathtaking 180-degree view of the Atlantic. It was a place of raw, untamed power. The winds there were stronger, the waves crashed louder. It was a location that demanded respect. I bought it in an all-cash deal that made headlines in the local business journal. I spent the next 3 years and an obscene amount of money building my masterpiece, a testament to my success that I named the Sentinel. It was more than a house. It was a statement. Looking out from its floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt a sense of invincibility I'd never known. I wasn't just a builder anymore, I was a master of my domain. I wasn't just building on the coast. I felt like I owned it, like I could command the tides themselves if I just stared at them long enough. And from that high perch, I was ready to conquer the world. I had no idea that I was really just building the most expensive tombstone a man could ask for. From the perch of the Sentinel, the world looked different. It looked manageable, ordered. The chaotic energy of the ocean was rendered into a perfect, silent panorama behind 3-inch thick, soundproofed glass. My mornings began not with an alarm clock, but with the automated whir of blackout shades ascending to reveal the Atlantic stretched out like a personal tapestry. The sun didn't just rise, it performed for me. That's what $300 million buys you, the illusion of command over the elements. The carpenter who loved the coast was a distant memory, a sepia-toned photograph of a man I no longer recognized. In his place stood Arthur Jensen, the king of the coast, a man who didn't just build houses but curated horizons. My life became a carefully orchestrated symphony of excess. My garage held a rotating collection of European metal, each car a sculpture of speed and status. I had a German sedan for business, an Italian sports car for the weekends, and a British Grand Tourer for when I wanted to feel like royalty. I rarely drove them myself. A driver named Marcus, a man of infinite patience and few words, handled the logistics. My yacht, a sleek 70-foot vessel I christened the Blueprint, was my floating office and private escape. I'd host politicians and so-called titans of industry on its teak decks. We'd drink single malt scotch that cost more than my father's first car and make deals that would reshape the coastline, all while the sun set in hues of orange and purple that felt, in my hubris, as if I had personally commissioned them. The parties at the Sentinel became legendary. Caterers would fly in from New York, sommeliers would pour wines from vineyards that didn't sell to the public, and people whose faces you'd recognize from magazine covers would mingle on my terrace. They weren't my friends. Friendship requires vulnerability, a currency I no longer traded in. They were assets, contacts, satellites, orbiting my gravitational pull of wealth. They laughed at my jokes, they praised my vision, and they wanted a piece of the magic I was supposedly creating. I saw them for what they were, and I enjoyed the game. I had transformed from a man who built things with his hands to a man who moved markets with a single phone call. The raw ambition that once fueled me had metastasized into something else, a deep, unshakable belief in my own infallibility. I wasn't just successful, I was correct. My gut, my instincts, were more reliable than any market analysis or spreadsheet. My past victories were not evidence of luck or timing. They were proof of my inherent superiority. It was this profound arrogance that set the stage for the first crack in my perfect glass fortress. It appeared not as a tremor in the earth, but as a man in a grey suit sitting in my minimalist office. His name was David Chen, my new risk management consultant from a firm that handled my massive insurance portfolio. With him was a meteorologist, a stern-looking academic named Dr. Aris Thorne, whom David had brought in for a specialized consultation. They unrolled charts and graphs across my marble conference table, a sea of data I immediately found irritating. "Mr. Jensen," David began, his voice laced with a caution I found distasteful. "We've been running predictive models on your portfolio concentration. To be blunt, your entire net worth is tied to a 15-mile stretch of coastline. It's the definition of having all your eggs in one basket." I leaned back in my leather chair, a smirk playing on my lips. "They're very, very nice baskets, David, and the eggs are made of gold." Dr. Thorne, who had been silent until then, cleared his throat. He pointed a long, bony finger at a chart, showing sea surface temperatures over the past 50 years. The line jagged steadily upward like a patient's fever chart. "Mr. Jensen, it's not just about the concentration. It's about the changing nature of the threat. The Atlantic is warmer than it has ever been in recorded history. This isn't a political debate. It's a thermodynamic fact. Warmer water is rocket fuel for hurricanes. The storm of the century is no longer a once-in-a-century event. Our models, which are conservative, suggest a greater than 60% probability of a Category 4 or 5 storm making direct landfall on this exact coastline within the next 5 to 10 years. I listened, but I wasn't hearing. I was processing his words through a filter of my own ego. A professor, a man who lived in a world of theory and computer simulations, was telling me about the ocean I saw every single day. I had built on this land for 3 decades. I knew its moods, its rhythms. I had weathered dozens of storms, seen nor'easters that would terrify a lesser man. My structures were fortresses of reinforced concrete and steel, with foundations driven deep into the bedrock. "A Category 5, Doctor," I said, the condescension dripping from my voice. "The last time a storm of that magnitude hit this area, they were driving Model T Fords. My buildings are engineered to withstand winds of up to 180 miles per hour. The windows on this very office can stop a bullet." "Wind is only one component," Thorne countered, his eyes unblinking. "It's the storm surge we're concerned about. With the current sea level rise, a major hurricane would push a wall of water inland that would be unprecedented. It wouldn't just flood, it would scour. It would act like a liquid bulldozer. Your foundations may be deep, Mr. Jensen, but the land they are anchored in is sand and rock that can be washed away." David chimed in, his tone urgent. "The recommendation from our underwriters is clear, Arthur. Diversify immediately. Sell 30, maybe 40% of your coastal assets. Move that capital inland. Real estate in non-coastal cities, commercial properties, anything to mitigate this singular catastrophic risk." I laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a deep, dismissive laugh from the belly. I stood up and walked to the vast window, placing my hand on the cool, unyielding glass. I looked down at the waves crashing harmlessly against the rocks below. It was all so beautiful, so peaceful. They were seeing danger. I was seeing my kingdom. "Gentlemen," I said, turning back to them, "I appreciate the diligence, but you're looking at numbers on a page. I am looking at reality. I built my fortune by taking risks everyone else was afraid of. I bought the unbuildable land. I built through recessions. I'm not about to sell off my masterpieces because a computer program predicts bad weather 5 years from now. I saw them as timid bureaucrats, men paid to imagine the worst-case scenario. I saw myself as a visionary, a man paid to create the best-case one." Dr. Thorne began to pack his briefcase, his face a mask of professional resignation. But as he turned to leave, he stopped and looked at me, not as a consultant to a client, but as one man to another. "Mr. Jensen," he said, his voice low and devoid of any emotion, "you're a brilliant builder. You've conquered land, materials, and engineering. But please remember one thing." He paused, letting the weight of his next words fill the silent room. "You do not negotiate with the ocean." I smiled, a thin, arrogant line. "Thank you for your time, Doctor." As soon as Marcus had escorted them out of the building, I walked back to the marble table. I looked at the report they had left behind, its cover emblazoned with the ominous title, Catastrophic Risk Analysis and Portfolio Mitigation Strategy. I saw its charts and its dire predictions not as a warning, but as an insult to my intelligence, an affront to everything I had built. I picked up the thick document, felt its weight in my hands, and I ripped it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter into the wastebasket. In my mind, I had just won a debate, reaffirming my dominance and superior judgment. In reality, I had just sealed my fate. Dismissing the warnings of my risk advisors didn't just feel like a decision. It felt like a declaration of war against the very concept of doubt. I saw their caution not as wisdom, but as a weakness in the market, a fear I could exploit. Instead of diversifying, I doubled down with the conviction of a zealot. My thinking was simple, and to my ego-addled mind utterly brilliant. If the whispers of catastrophic risk were scaring off the smaller fish, it was the perfect time for a leviathan like me to swallow them whole. My strategy shifted from creation to consolidation. I was no longer just a builder. I became a predator. I started a quiet but aggressive acquisition campaign. My team would identify long-time property owners along the coast, people whose families had held beachfront cottages for generations. These were not speculators. They were people with deep roots in the sand, but they were also the ones most vulnerable to the skyrocketing insurance premiums that followed the nervous forecasts. My offers were always just below market value, but they were in cash with a quick close. It was a tempting proposition for anyone feeling the squeeze. I was buying their heritage, their slice of paradise, and in its place I planned to build newer, bigger, more luxurious monuments to my own vision. I told myself I was a genius, capitalizing on baseless anxiety. I was a contrarian investor making a bold play. In truth, I was a fool buying up all the front-row seats on the Titanic after it had already hit the iceberg. My exposure to the coast went from dangerously concentrated to absurdly, almost comically, total. I owned nearly every significant property along that 15-mile stretch. I was the king of a kingdom, balanced on the edge of a knife. This relentless drive to conquer the physical world was having a corrosive effect on my personal one. The Sentinel, my glass palace on the cliff, was less a home and more a beautifully appointed mausoleum for my marriage. My wife, Helena, had been my partner in the early days. She was the one who managed the books while I was framing walls, the one who believed in my dream when it was just a sketch on a napkin. But the man she had married, the hungry, passionate carpenter, had been eroded away by success, leaving behind a hollowed-out tycoon. She saw the change long before I did. "Arthur, when is it enough?" she asked me one evening. We were standing on the terrace, a brutalist expanse of polished concrete overlooking the deceptively calm ocean. She wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at me, her eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. "We have more money than our grandchildren could ever spend. Why are you still pushing like this? It's not ambition anymore. It's something else. It's a hunger that can't be filled." I waved a dismissive hand, a gesture I had perfected. "Helena, you don't understand the momentum. This is the crucial phase. We're consolidating. It's about legacy." "Legacy?" she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "What legacy? Building bigger houses so people we don't know can escape their lives for 2 weeks a year? Our son barely speaks to you. You missed his college graduation because you were closing a deal on that property in North Cove. That's your legacy right now, Arthur. A string of beautiful empty rooms." Her words were arrows, and because they struck so close to the truth, my only defense was to build my walls higher. "I'm building this for us, for our family," I retorted, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Security is what I provide. Just let me handle the business side of things." It was the ultimate condescension, reducing our 30-year partnership to a departmental affair. The chasm between us grew wider with every new acquisition. She started spending more time in the city, finding solace in her charity work, in a world where value wasn't measured in square footage. I was too busy counting my gold to notice I was losing my greatest treasure. Then came the second warning. This one wasn't a man in a suit or a set of charts. This one was delivered by the wind and the rain. A tropical storm, not even a hurricane, a system named Chloe, churned up the coast. It was a messy, disorganized squall, but it lingered for 3 days, relentlessly lashing the shoreline with gale-force winds and torrential downpours. It wasn't the kind of storm that makes national news, but it was a potent dress rehearsal for what was to come. For the first time, I felt a flicker of unease. From my perch in the Sentinel, I watched the storm surge push the tide line higher than I had ever seen. Waves that normally broke 100 yards out were now crashing against the foundations of my frontline properties. The ocean was no longer a beautiful painting. It was an angry beast clawing at my door. When the storm finally passed, the damage was significant. Not catastrophic, but deeply unsettling. Several of my properties suffered extensive water damage from the flooding. Beach erosion was severe, carving away feet of precious sand and dunes that had acted as natural barriers. The most symbolic damage occurred at one of my flagship rental properties, the Azure. Its signature infinity pool, an engineering marvel that appeared to merge seamlessly with the ocean, had cracked under the pressure of the saturated ground beneath it. The foundation had shifted, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. A jagged fissure ran through the gleaming blue tiles, and half the pool had simply sheared off and collapsed down the embankment. The repairs cost a fortune, but the real blow came from the insurance adjusters. They walked the properties with grim faces, their clipboards filled with notations that spelled financial doom. A few weeks later, the letters started arriving. My insurance carriers, citing the increased risk demonstrated by Chloe, were raising my premiums across the entire portfolio by 40%. One carrier dropped me altogether. They weren't just covering their risk, they were sending a message. They were trying to price me out of my own kingdom. My accountant, a perpetually worried man named Frank, called me in a state of near panic. His voice on the phone was thin and strained. "Arthur, we have a major problem. These new premiums, they're untenable. They'll decimate our cash flow. Worse, I'm hearing chatter in the industry. They're starting to label our portfolio as uninsurable. The concentration is just too high. If another carrier drops us, we could have a domino effect. Without insurance, the banks can call in the loans. The whole thing, Arthur, the whole thing is a house of cards." I stood in my office looking out at the perfectly calm, sun-dappled ocean. The memory of the storm felt like a bad dream. The infinity pool was already being repaired. The eroded beaches were being replenished with truckloads of new sand. Everything looked perfect again. My arrogance interpreted this return to normalcy as a sign of my resilience, not as a temporary reprieve. "Find a solution, Frank," I said, my voice cold and hard. "That's what I pay you for. Look for offshore carriers, restructure the LLCs, do whatever it takes. This is just a shakedown by the insurance companies, a cost of doing business." I hung up the phone, cutting off his frantic protests. I truly believed it. I believed that every problem, every obstacle, every force of nature could be overcome with a sufficient application of money and will. My will. I was convinced that money wasn't just a tool, it was a form of magic, a shield that could deflect reality itself. I was profoundly wrong. There are some problems that money cannot solve. There are some debts that cannot be paid with cash. And the ocean was slowly, patiently, preparing to present me with its final, non-negotiable invoice. The final act began, not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper on the periphery of the weather reports. It was a tropical disturbance off the coast of Africa, a seemingly innocuous swirl of clouds on the satellite map, thousands of miles away. In late August, such formations are as common as afternoon thunderstorms. I paid it no mind. My attention was consumed by a hostile takeover bid I was orchestrating for a smaller regional competitor. My world was one of contracts, interest rates, and shareholder value. The whims of the atmosphere felt abstract, irrelevant. But this particular whisper refused to fade. Over the next few days, it gathered strength over the unnaturally warm waters of the Atlantic, growing from a disturbance into a depression, then a named storm. The meteorologists called her Hera. Even then, I felt a detached sense of curiosity, not fear. I had seen dozens of named storms veer off course, weaken, and dissipate into nothing more than a few days of gloomy rain. My entire life experience had taught me that the real threat was almost always less than the televised hype. But Hera was different. She didn't meander. She moved with a terrifying purpose, a straight-line trajectory across the ocean, as if she had a destination in mind. The spaghetti models, those colorful, chaotic lines predicting a storm's potential path, began to converge with chilling unanimity, all pointing to a single, horrifying focal point: my 15-mile stretch of coastline. The news anchors started using language I had only ever heard in disaster movies. Unprecedented, monstrous, a perfect storm. They talked about her rapid intensification, her symmetrical eye wall, her staggering barometric pressure. She wasn't just a Category 4 anymore. She was pushing the upper limits of Category 5, a meteorological anomaly of terrifying power. The governor declared a state of emergency. Then came the evacuation orders, first voluntary, then mandatory. My little coastal paradise transformed overnight. The highways leading inland became rivers of red taillights. Plywood went up over the windows of the few businesses I didn't own. The place became a ghost town, eerily silent, except for the rising howl of the wind. My staff, my property managers, my construction foreman, they all pleaded with me to leave. "Arthur, it's just stuff," my lead architect told me, his face pale with genuine concern. "We can rebuild. Let's get out of here." I saw their fear not as a rational response, but as a lack of faith in me, in my creations. Leaving felt like an admission of defeat. It felt like conceding that Dr. Thorne and his charts had been right all along. My pride, now a fortress as massive and brittle as the Sentinel itself, would not allow it. In an act of supreme, almost pathological arrogance, I decided to stay. More than that, I decided to make a statement. I agreed to a live remote interview with a national news channel. A young, rain-drenched reporter stood on a windswept bluff a few miles inland, while I appeared on a massive screen behind her, seated calmly in my living room, the darkening, turbulent sea visible through the window behind me. "Mr. Jensen," she asked, shouting over the wind, "you've defied the mandatory evacuation order. You are a prominent figure in this community. What message are you sending by staying?" I leaned forward, looking directly into the camera, a picture of calm authority. "I'm sending a message of confidence," I said, my voice smooth and measured. "Confidence in the engineering and craftsmanship that went into every single one of my properties. This home, the Sentinel, was built to withstand precisely this kind of event. I have a generator, supplies, and a deep respect for the power of nature. But I also have an unshakable faith in the power of human ingenuity. I will ride this out, and I will be here tomorrow to begin the cleanup." I was performing, playing the role of the steadfast captain who refuses to abandon his ship. The final, desperate attempt to save me came from the person I had pushed away the most. My son, Michael, a young man I barely knew anymore, drove for 6 hours against the flow of evacuating traffic to get to me. He arrived just as the first squall bands began to lash the coast, his car rocking in the wind. He burst into the Sentinel, his face a mask of terror and fury. "What the hell are you doing?" he screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "I saw you on TV. Is this a joke to you? This isn't about your buildings, Dad. This is about your life. Mom is a wreck. We could lose you." I tried to pacify him with the same condescending tone I used on everyone else. "Michael, calm down. Everything is under control. This house is the safest place on the entire coast." "Safest place?" he shot back, gesturing wildly at the raging sea. "It's the bullseye. For God's sake, Dad, for once in your life, stop trying to prove something. There is nothing left to prove. Just come with me, please. Forget the money, forget the legacy. Let's just go." For a fleeting moment, I saw the terror in his eyes. I felt the desperate love in his plea, and the ice around my heart almost cracked. A part of me, the carpenter's son who once loved the simple smell of the sea, wanted to go with him. But the king of the coast, the man who had ripped up the report and laughed at the warnings, couldn't back down. To leave now would be to admit that my entire life, my entire philosophy, had been a colossal mistake. "I'm not leaving," I said, the words as hard and cold as the marble floor. "This is my life's work. I don't run from it." He stared at me for a long moment, a look of profound, bottomless disappointment on his face. It was the look of a son realizing his father was a stranger, A man hopelessly lost in his own myth. He didn't argue further. He just shook his head slowly. "Okay, Dad," he whispered, the fight gone from his voice. "I love you." He turned and walked out, swallowed by the wind and the rain. It was the last time we would speak before my world ended. As dusk fell, the storm's overture began. The wind's howl deepened into a visceral, guttural roar, a sound that seemed to come from the very lungs of the planet. I stood in my living room, the one with the billion-dollar view, and poured myself a glass of 25-year-old scotch. The lights flickered and died, but the emergency generator kicked in with a reassuring hum from the basement. Outside, the world had disappeared into a horizontal blur of grey spray and black water. The waves were no longer individual crests. They had become a single surging mass, a liquid mountain range moving towards me. I raised my glass to the window, a silent toast to the oncoming darkness. A final, defiant challenge. "All right, Hera," I murmured to the storm, the words lost in the cacophony. "Let's see what you've got." And then, as if in direct answer, the first pane of my 3-inch thick, bullet-resistant, hurricane-proof glass didn't just crack. It exploded inward. A 600-pound sheet of engineered perfection vaporized into a million glittering shards, and the storm was no longer outside. It was in the house with me. Before I tell you what happened in the heart of that long, violent night, let me ask you something. If you've journeyed this far with me, watching me build my sandcastle and ignore every tide, I want you to do 2 things. First, if you haven't already, please make sure you're subscribed. Your being here means more than you know. Second, I need your honest opinion in the comments below. What do you believe was my single greatest mistake? Was it the raw pride, the refusal to listen to experts, or the sheer folly of concentrating my entire world in one vulnerable place? I've spent years dissecting that question myself, and I'm genuinely curious to see my downfall through your eyes. The explosion of the first window wasn't just a sound. It was a physical concussion that threw me backward. The scotch glass shattered in my hand, and the wind, a solid screaming entity, slammed into me like a freight train. It wasn't air anymore. It was a pressurized torrent filled with sand, salt, and debris, a liquid sandblaster that stripped the paint from the walls in an instant. The serene, minimalist living room was instantly transformed into a vortex of unimaginable chaos. Priceless art was ripped from its moorings and shredded. Custom-made furniture weighing hundreds of pounds was tossed about like dollhouse toys. The roar was absolute, a deafening, all-consuming sound that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. All the carefully curated silence and peace I had engineered was gone, replaced by the pure, undiluted voice of nature's fury. My immediate instinct was survival. I was no longer the king of the coast. I was just an animal trapped in a collapsing cage. I crawled on my hands and knees, the floor slick with seawater and littered with the glittering shrapnel of my broken world. The wind tore at my clothes, and the sheer force of it made it impossible to stand. Every few seconds, another window would give way with a percussive boom, each one an invitation for more of the ocean to pour inside. The house groaned and shuddered around me, the death rattles of a dying giant. The Sentinel, my fortress of ingenuity, my testament to permanence, was being systematically dismembered. I managed to scramble into the central hallway, away from the direct line of the wind. My goal was the master bathroom, an interior room built like a bunker with reinforced concrete walls. As I clawed my way through the darkness, the building lurched violently, a sickening, grinding motion that felt like the foundation itself was being torn from the bedrock. The lights from the generator flickered and went out for good, plunging me into absolute blackness. The only illumination came from the terrifying, strobing flashes of lightning that lit up the apocalyptic scene outside, a churning, white-frothed chaos where the ocean and sky had merged into one. In those brief, horrifying snapshots, I saw things that my mind still struggles to process. My 70-foot yacht, the blueprint, being tossed end over end in the surf like a child's toy. The roofs of my other properties peeling away like tin can lids. Entire trees ripped out by the roots flying sideways through the air. I finally reached the bathroom and threw my weight against the heavy oak door, bolting it shut. The relative silence inside was even more terrifying. I could still hear the storm, but it was muffled. a low-frequency rumble that was felt more than heard. I was in the belly of the beast, and in that darkness, huddled on the cold marble floor, stripped of all my power and bravado, the terror finally gave way to a profound, soul-crushing realization. I was going to die. Here, in this monument to my own ego, I was going to be erased. And in that moment, the $300 million, the portfolio, the legacy, it all meant less than nothing. It was just ballast dragging me to the bottom. All I could think about was the look on my son's face, the disappointment, the final whispered, "I love you." I had traded all my chances for a last hug, a final conversation, for the right to be proven correct. And I had lost the wager. I curled into a ball on the floor, and for the first time since I was a small boy, I wept. I don't know how long I was in that room. Hours bled together in a timeless ordeal of noise and vibration. Sometime before dawn, the character of the sound began to change. The violent, high-pitched shriek of the wind subsided, replaced by a deep, gurgling sound. The storm surge had arrived. I felt the water seeping under the door, cold and insistent. It rose quickly, climbing past my ankles to my knees. The house was no longer on a cliff. It was part of the ocean. Then, as gradually as it began, the fury started to recede. The winds lessened. The rhythmic shuddering of the house ceased. A strange, eerie silence descended, broken only by the drip of water. After what felt like an eternity, I unbolted the door. It wouldn't budge. The pressure of the water and debris on the other side had sealed it shut. Panic flared again, hot and acidic. I threw my shoulder against it again and again until the wood splintered and I tumbled out into the wreckage of my home. The dawn light revealed a scene of absolute annihilation. There was no living room. The entire ocean-facing side of the house was gone, sheared away as if by a giant blade. All that remained was a jagged concrete platform, open to the sky. And the view was unrecognizable. My kingdom was gone. My pristine coastline, dotted with architectural marvels, had been wiped clean. There was nothing but a wasteland of splintered wood, twisted metal, and mud. The verdant hills were stripped bare. The majestic cliffs were scarred and broken. The ocean, now a placid, muddy brown, lapped gently at the shore as if feigning innocence. My empire, the work of 30 years, had been unwritten from the landscape in a single night. The financial collapse was swifter and more brutal than the storm. In the days that followed, the full scope of the devastation became clear. My properties weren't just damaged, they were gone, obliterated. The insurance adjusters came, not with clipboards, but with cameras to document the total loss. Then came the lawyers with copies of the fine print, clauses invoking acts of God, provisions for flood damage that were capped at a fraction of the structure's worth. The payouts, when they came at all, were a pittance, a cruel joke. The banks, my erstwhile partners in prosperity, were not so sentimental. With the collateral underlying their massive loans now non-existent, they called in their notes. All of them. All at once. The phone calls were relentless. A chorus of polite but implacable demands for tens of millions of dollars I no longer had. The numbers were so large they were meaningless. It was a financial house of cards, and the hurricane hadn't just blown on it. It had incinerated it. My lawyers advised bankruptcy was the only option, not a restructuring, but a full liquidation. Chapter 7. The end of the line. The process was a systematic and public humiliation. Every asset was catalogued and seized. The cars, the art collection, the remaining bank accounts. The headlines were savage. Coastal king dethroned by Hera. Arrogance washed away. The Jensen empire crumbles. The friends who had once clamored for invitations to my parties now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Helena filed for divorce. I couldn't blame her. I had given her nothing of myself for years. There was nothing left for her to hold on to. I ended up, for a few nights, in a Red Cross shelter set up in a high school gymnasium, sleeping on a cot surrounded by hundreds of other people who had lost everything. They had lost their modest homes, their photo albums, their pets. I had lost an empire, and yet huddled there under a coarse wool blanket holding a styrofoam cup of lukewarm soup, I had never felt more like them. I was no longer Arthur Jensen, the visionary tycoon. I was just a man. an old broken man who had nothing left but the bitter taste of the truth. The immediate aftermath of the bankruptcy was a disorienting freefall. For 30 years, my identity had been inextricably fused with my net worth. Arthur Jensen was the man who built things, the man who owned the coast, the man whose name on a blueprint was a guarantee of quality and prestige. When the money vanished, the man himself seemed to dissolve along with it. The first few months were a grey, featureless fog of depression and shame. I was living in a small furnished apartment on the far side of town, a place so anonymous it felt like a witness protection safe house. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. There were no phones ringing with deal proposals, no assistants bustling with schedules, no hum of a vast enterprise at work. There was only the quiet ticking of a cheap clock on the wall, measuring out the seconds of my new, profoundly empty existence. The world I had once commanded now seemed alien and hostile. Simple tasks felt like monumental challenges. Riding a city bus, navigating a grocery store, applying for government assistance. These were humbling rituals of a life I had only ever observed from behind tinted glass. There were days I wouldn't leave the apartment, paralyzed by the fear of seeing a familiar face, of having to endure the pity or, worse, the schadenfreude in their eyes. I was a ghost, haunting the ruins of my own life, convinced that my story was over, that the final chapter had been written by the wind and the water. The lifeline came from the one person I least deserved it from. My son, Michael, started showing up. He didn't come with lectures or "I told you so's." He came with bags of groceries. He'd sit in the uncomfortable armchair across from me and just talk about his work, about a movie he'd seen, about anything other than the wreckage of my past. He was rebuilding a bridge I had dynamited long ago, plank by painful plank. One Saturday he showed up with 2 tool belts slung over his shoulder. "A friend of mine is heading up a volunteer crew," he said, avoiding my gaze. "They're helping folks in the lower cove rebuild. Families who lost everything and didn't have insurance. They need people who know how to swing a hammer." I told them my dad was the best carpenter I ever knew. The best carpenter he ever knew. He hadn't called me a tycoon, a CEO, or a visionary. He had reached back through all the years of arrogance and wealth and found the man I used to be. My first instinct was to refuse. The humiliation of it, me, Arthur Jensen, framing a roof for free. But the look in my son's eyes wasn't one of pity. It was a challenge, an invitation. I hadn't held a hammer for a purpose other than a ceremonial photo op in decades, but I took the tool belt. It felt heavy, unfamiliar, and yet profoundly right. That first day on the worksite was a crucible. I was just another pair of hands, an old man in worn-out jeans taking orders from a crew chief half my age. The work was brutal, punishing on a body softened by years of luxury. My back ached. My hands, once accustomed to the smooth leather of a steering wheel, were quickly blistered and raw. But something strange happened as the days turned into weeks. As the sweat dripped from my brow and soaked my shirt, it felt like I was washing away a layer of grime that had encrusted my soul for 30 years. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer, the scent of fresh-cut pine, the shared exhaustion and simple camaraderie with the other volunteers. It was a homecoming I never knew I needed. We were rebuilding a small house for a young family, a school teacher and her husband, a fisherman who had 2 small children. They had lost everything. One afternoon, while we were raising the last roof truss, the wife, a woman named Maria, came out with a tray of lemonade and some sandwiches. She handed one to me, her hands calloused from her own work of sifting through the wreckage of her life. She looked at me, not as the disgraced millionaire from the newspapers, but as one of the men who was giving her family a future. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a gratitude so immense it was almost a physical force. "I don't know how we can ever repay you all." I took a bite of the sandwich. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. In that moment, holding that simple offering, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced since I sold that first bungalow on the rocky outcrop, a feeling of pure, unadulterated value. But this time, it wasn't transactional. It wasn't about the money, it was about human connection. It was about creating something essential not for profit but for people. I looked at the frame of the new house, a skeleton of hope rising from the mud, and I understood. The hurricane hadn't destroyed my empire. It had obliterated the prison I had meticulously constructed for myself. For decades, I had measured my worth in dollars, in square footage, in the envy of other men. I had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that those metrics were a fool's game. True value isn't stored in a bank vault. It's created in the space between people, in acts of service, in shared struggle, in simple, honest gratitude. That was the turning point. I didn't try to get back into real estate. The desire was gone. The hunger that Helena had seen in me had finally been sated, not by success, but by failure. I continued working with the volunteer crews, finding a quiet purpose in the simple act of building. My relationship with Michael blossomed. I became a grandfather, and I discovered the profound joy of holding a small hand in mine, a connection far more real and lasting than any business deal. I have very little now in the way the world measures things. I live in this small apartment. I collect a modest social security check. But I am wealthier now than I ever was at the height of my power. My wealth is in the easy laughter I share with my son, in the stories I read to my grandchildren, in the peaceful sleep that comes after a day of honest, physical labor. The lesson that cost me $300 million is this: money is a powerful amplifier. It will make you more of what you already are. If you are generous, it will make you a philanthropist. If you are insecure, it will make you ostentatious. And if you are arrogant, as I was, it will make you a god in your own mind, blind to the cliffs and deaf to the rising tide. The most important foundation you can ever build is not made of concrete and steel. It is forged from humility, character, and love. That is the only structure that no storm can ever wash away. Everything else is just sand, waiting for the ocean to reclaim it. If my story has resonated with you in any way, I ask you to do one last thing for me. Share this video with one person you know who might need to hear this message. Sometimes, a lesson learned the hard way can save someone else from the same path. And finally, for my own curiosity and for everyone else here, please leave a comment below and share this. What is the greatest lesson about life or money that you have ever learned? Reading your wisdom would be a gift. Thank you for listening.